down on that string, and he is changing or varying the pitch slightly so that to give emotion to the sound. Well, these wheels take the place of that. In other words, on a flute sound that I have up, so that varying in pitch is as I move the wheel away from me, we would get that flutter tone in the pitch. Now that can be used, of course, artfully to express emotion within a musical piece.
And besides the keyboard and the controller wheels, there's another way to influence the sound, one that's not found very often on synthesizers, which makes this one feel more like a real wind instrument. As he runs his fingers over the keys, Clendeninn also blows into a small black plastic tube connected to the VL1. The machine senses how hard he's blowing, and just like a real horn, it changes the tone and volume of the sound. Phil Clendeninn isn't really an oboe player, but he remembers the time when a professional oboist tried out the VL1.
We were working on an oboe sound. When we finally got it just the way that was intuitive to him, he had to put the instrument down. It was, I thought he had gotten electric shock or something. He said, "Oh my goodness, it just became an oboe."
Inside this synthesizer, there is a kind of oboe. But this oboe is a set of equations that represent such things as its length and weight, what it's made of, and what happens when your lips are tight around the reed. It's a mathematical model of the real thing. It's this mathematical model that makes the Yamaha VL1 fundamentally new. It turns playing music into a problem in physics. Calculate exactly how a horn will vibrate as you blow into it, and the answer is the sound. It uses equations like this one.
Let Y denote string displacement, and it'll be a function of time and position X.
Julius Smith is director of the Center for Computer Research in Music and Acoustics, fondly known as KARMA at Stanford University.
Then the wave equation reads K times the second derivative of Y with respect to X is equal to epsilon times the second derivative of Y with respect to T.
This equation, called a wave equation, describes what creates sound, like how a string vibrates when it's plucked. It describes a balance of forces, the tension of the string, which constantly tries to bring that string back to a straight line, and the string's inertia, which makes it keep overshooting that middle point so it swings back and forth. It's that vibration that creates sound. Smith didn't design Yamaha's synthesizer, but he and his colleagues helped teach Yamaha and several of its competitors how to. He's been a pioneer in the field of creating music with computers, although it's not the path he thought his musical career would take.
So I was always playing out. In fact, I was playing in places I shouldn't be playing at the age of 16, and I thought I was actually going to be a professional musician for many years, but I didn't have as much talent for music as I did for math, basically. That was really the forcing function on all of this.
So Smith learned the language of mathematics, studying electrical engineering, where he encountered wave equations for the first time. They're as old as the music of Bach, developed by mathematicians to explain how the instruments of that time really worked. For Smith, though, they were the key to the instruments of the future.
Well, let me tell you the story from there. Okay, so you've got your wave equation. It's a very good description of the vibrational properties of the string. And that's not to be taken for granted. That's not a trivial thing, because when you look at the surface of a string under a scanning electron microscope, it looks complicated. You know, the structure of nylon polymers are very complicated, and you've got a very complex structure that you're stretching there. So the fact that it's all expressed very well by a small equation that just balances two types of force is pretty lucky.
Equations like this aren't just used to describe a vibrating string. They're part of mathematical models that are used to control airplanes in flight or industrial robots. Smith, though, wanted to use them in a computer program that would imitate the sound of a violin. But he knew that for a computer, he couldn't use all the equations.
You want enough of the physics to sound the same, but it's very important to take out the rest, because if you implement all of the physics in your equations, it's going to run very, very slowly. And the computer can run all night just to produce one squeak. And that, in fact, was done in the 70s. The art in computer modeling of musical instruments is to find the physics that determine the sound of the instrument and to just weed away everything else. It's analogous to making a caricature where that caricature is all you really hear.
In the end, Smith came up with a program that creates the sound of a violin with only a few lines of computer code.
And it has to be that simple because it has to execute essentially 44,100 times per second to compute digital audio at CD quality sampling rates.
Derivative of y with respect to t.
K times the second derivative of y with respect to x squared is equal to epsilon times the second derivative of y with respect to t. K times the second derivative of y with respect to x squared is equal to epsilon.
Each calculation, each tiny fraction of a second, tells the surface of a loudspeaker what to do at that instant to recreate the vibration of a violin string or the air from inside a saxophone. Julia Smith says when a computer program is accurately imitating a real instrument, like the way a horn squeaks or suddenly jumps from one pitch to another, it's right on the edge of chaos. Phil Clendeninn, the man who's showing off the VL1 for potential customers, pulls out a small, thin penny whistle to demonstrate.
As you overblow the penny whistle, the pitch apparently jumps an octave, goes the same note but an octave higher. And the same characteristic thing would happen in the virtual acoustic synthesis. Since we have a model of a tube, much like the penny whistle, with the same hole spacing and so forth, when I overblow on the virtual acoustic synthesizer, it also jumps the octave.
The Yamaha VL1 gives a musician so many ways to control the sound with its keyboard, controller wheels, and mouthpiece that you really have to learn to play it. Some people say it's actually pretty hard to learn.
Trumpet with a lemon in the room, if you will. So what I was doing was adjusting the embouchure as a non-experienced musician who can't hold the lips together tight enough to get a pure pitch. I was doing that by moving a wheel above and below a center position, which means I was loosening and tightening the lips, as a beginner would, trying to get control over the physical gesture.
But you can also play it well, and that's the point. For musicians that want to perform with synthesizers, it's a realistic-sounding solo instrument. Other musicians, especially composers, are intrigued by the VL1 and its mathematical models for another reason. It can create instruments that can't exist in real life.
I can combine, let's say, the headstock of a flute with the body of an oboe. Or I can do a brass and I mean, these combination instruments, what we call new acoustics.
You can do this right here?
Oh, sure. I'm going to do a bowed element on a wooden pipe, on a flute, a bowed flute, if you would. You are taking the mathematics of the bow and applying it to a tube.
The VL1 promises to be the first in a wave of new synthesizers based on mathematical models of real instruments. Like the first of anything, it's limited in what it can do and the new instruments it can create. But in principle, these techniques could be used to create the sound of a 20-foot flute, or any instrument you can imagine and describe with equations. A couple of centuries ago in Europe, instrument makers began to use mathematicians to help design their pianos and organs. But Phil Clendeninn says the instrument designers of today are the scientists, people like Julia Smith, creating instruments with their imagination and lines of computer code.
with apologies to Ravel.
This is Dan Charles in Washington.
It's all things.